Okay, so we're going to go ahead and talk about the review for Monday morning, Monday afternoon, depending on when I have you. I think I posted the Word document of the things that we'll be covering, so let's go ahead and take a look at those together. One of the first things we want to talk about is, first of all, you have two options. Either you can look at the Cengage textbook, the Cengage website. The login information has been provided. It's the same logon information as you have for like your laptops. In that version, we're looking at chapter 16. If you are looking at the PDF version that I've put in Teams, that's going to be listed as chapter 18. There's just different different versions of it. The Cengage website, as you know, has been on and off, but I believe it's on now. So the first thing we want to talk about is this word syncretism. We've talked about it 100 times, actually, and syncretism is a blending or infusing of different traditions. And as Christianity in the 1500s became more and more dominant, they had to sort out what do they believe about people who practice witchcraft. And witchcraft was a traditional religion. It had been practiced for a long time. And for Christianity, they began to view witchcraft as real still. It was still believed to be real, but they attributed witchcraft to satanic forces. And so we see in the 1500s, people are kind of evaluating traditional religion, and the way they process traditional religious practices is ascribing it to Satan, saying it's evil. So in addition, in this chapter, we're talking about other big ideas and changes. And in the 1500s, a huge change is something we talked about called the Protestant Reformation. So the most important guy in the Protestant Reformation is Luther. You might remember Luther was a Catholic priest. He had made this vow to serve, but Luther became really questioning the Catholic Church, especially because of what he saw with the sale of indulgences. We remember that indulgences are these things that you can do or things that you could purchase at his time that would take time off of purgatory. And purgatory is this place of punishment. It's this place of waiting. And if you do what you're supposed to do for long enough or pay what you are supposed to pay, you can get grandma or grandpa out of purgatory. And so Luther is upset about these indulgences. Luther is upset about these different things. And he comes to embrace, from reading the Bible, this idea called sola fide, which is this idea of faith alone, that it's only by faith in what Jesus did with his life, death, and resurrection. That's the only thing required in order to get to heaven. It's not indulgences. It's not going to church. It's not doing good deeds. It's sola fide. And means that indulgences you don't need. You don't need a pope anymore. You don't need all these sorts of things. This is a protest. It's the Protestant Reformation. And one of the things that allows Luther to do this, of course, you might remember he writes his 95 Theses. These are 95 things he thinks are wrong with the Catholic Church. And one of the things that helps get his message across is the technology of printing. This is a relatively new technology, but it's kind of like the internet. It's what allows Luther's message to go viral, and not just to make local news and then die out, but for his message to go out all throughout Europe. And it does. A lot of people become dissatisfied with the Catholic Church because of corruption. They become dissatisfied with the Catholic Church because they think that Catholic priests don't have meaningful answers. They're dissatisfied partly because they see even Luther as pro-German. And the Pope, he's not from Germany. He is from Rome. So there's even some people who choose to be Lutheran or Protestant for not religious reasons, but for nationalistic reasons. We also talked about a different type of Protestant. There's a guy named Calvin, and so his type of Protestantism is called Calvinism. He totally agreed with Luther on sola fide. He totally agreed on sola scriptura, the belief that if it's not in the Bible, you shouldn't believe it. But Calvin went actually a little bit further, and what Calvin argued is that all those things that Luther brought up are true, but he also said, you know what? I want to stress the belief in what we refer to as predestination, that before any of us were born, before there was stars or a planet or a sun or a moon, that God predestined some to go to heaven and some to go to hell. But everything else he agrees with Luther on, but he has a strict focus on predestination. There's a third type of Protestantism called Anglicanism, which comes from the Church of England. You might remember this Henry VIII that he wanted really to have a male heir. He couldn't have one. He asked for what is called not a divorce, but an indulgence from the king, from the Pope. The Pope was in an awkward position because Catherine of Aragon was a well-known Catholic. She was also the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, who was like the most important Catholic on the planet. He denied the indulgence, so Henry VIII decided to break from the Catholic Church, not because of deep-seated religious convictions, though he did think that he was sinning by being married to his sister-in-law, who was a widow with Henry VIII's brother dying. But even though there was some real, he actually did believe it was wrong, he ultimately broke not with Rome, not because he was a Protestant of deep-seated convictions like Luther and Calvin, but he was a Protestant of convenience because he, by becoming the head of the Church of England, he could make sure that people would allow him to get this divorce. And so he moves England towards the Protestant direction. After Henry VIII dies, we do see that there's a young kid who becomes king briefly but dies at age 15, moving the church further in the Protestant direction. But then we have two sisters who take over. There's Mary, sometimes called Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor, and she is Catholic. She brings the church in England back to the Catholic Church. She kills 300 Protestants, where she gets the term Bloody Mary. And then after her death to stomach cancer, we see Elizabeth take over, moving it back into the Protestant direction, though she does kill 1,000 Catholics. Now, how do we make sure that people don't leave Team Catholic Church anymore? There's something called the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation, and this is where the Catholic Church is trying to answer Protestant questions. Are there things that we can do to fix mistakes of the past? Are there things that we can do to correct or clarify things about what it means to be Catholic? And ultimately, they meet at the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church does. And they meet at the Council of Trent to clarify doctrine, to clarify beliefs. What is it that we believe? What do we hold on to? One of the things about the Council of Trent is they said, you know what, we do believe heaven is Jesus plus doing good works. This whole faith alone thing is wrong. It's okay if things aren't in the Bible. You can still believe it if it's not in the Bible, if the church says it's so. You might remember the Council of Trent also said transubstantiation is also true. That means that the wine literally becomes the blood of Jesus. The bread literally becomes the body of Jesus. The Council of Trent, this meeting of Catholics at the Counter-Reformation, they're countering the Reformation's questions, says all that's true. The only change they make about indulgences is you can still do things for indulgences, you just can't straight up buy indulgences. One of the big problems in the Reformation era was a lot of people were leaving the Catholic Church because the Catholic priests didn't have really good answers to Luther's questions. And so during the Counter-Reformation, there's a group of super well-educated Catholic priests. These are like the smart of the smart. These are the AP Catholic priests, and they're called the Jesuits. They're a part of a group called the Society of Jesus, started by a man named Loyola. They had personal loyalty to the Pope, and they were so well educated. They were sent all around the world as missionaries. They could learn Chinese, they could learn Japanese, and they could, most importantly, answer Protestant questions. But it's not just the Reformation in the 1500s that is causing massive changes. We also see the scientific revolution. For the Protestants, religiously, it wasn't good enough for you to say, well, I am a Catholic. I believe these Catholic beliefs because God says it's so. You know what? I have indulgences. God says it's so. I have saints. God says it's so. The Protestants said, show me evidence from the Bible. In the same way, the scientific revolution says it's not enough for us to say, I believe something because the answer to something is basically God says it's so. The scientific revolution says we need to look to answers that are not just, well, because God made it that way. We need to use reason. We need to use evidence. We need to use experiments. And that's why we see people like Copernicus challenging things that were believed forever. Before Copernicus, Europeans believed, and this was commonly taught, that the Earth was the center of the solar system. But when Copernicus worked out the math, when Copernicus looked at the observations he saw in the stars, the evidence does not match up with the idea that we are the center of the solar system. So Copernicus is the guy who argues for heliocentric world, the idea that or heliocentric solar system, that the sun is the center. And so for him, he got some flack, he got some trouble with the Catholic Church because he was challenging people had believed. They thought, well, the Bible in their minds implied that the earth is the center, and the church says it's so, so it's so. Copernicus says, you know what, we cannot take that as an answer if the data says otherwise. You might remember that for the Jesuits, there was a saying. They said, if the church, Catholic Church, tells me white is black or black is white, I will believe it. There was a sense of not questioning, which is why Copernicus' book and his colleague Galileo's book actually get part of a list of books that Catholics are not supposed to read. There was an index of forbidden books because it challenged the Catholic Church. Galileo was famous for using a telescope. This telescope allowed him to observe the surface of the moon. And the Catholic Church kind of taught and implied that since God made everything perfect, you'd expect a perfect, smooth moon surface. But instead, he found craters and imperfections. And that kind of rocked the religious world of what religious people thought the moon should look like. But for these guys, they put facts over these interpretations of the Catholic Church. You also see the Enlightenment, just like the scientific revolution said, well, there's probably like rules to the universe that if we observe and we experiment, we can find about the rules of the scientific world. That was the scientific revolution. We're looking for science, we're looking for evidence, we're going to use experiments. There's rules out there just to be discovered. And the Enlightenment says, well, just like the scientific revolution was rules about the natural world, rules about gravity, rules about math, rules about astronomy, the Enlightenment says, I bet there's also rules to human society, human interactions. And so similarly in the Enlightenment, they're looking for some natural laws. What are some natural rights? Some really great things about the Enlightenment was tolerance of ideas. Voltaire once said that no idea is worth burning your neighbor for. So there's this idea that we should dialogue, we should debate, but we shouldn't hate each other over our dialogue and debate. There's another Enlightenment quote saying, something like, I don't agree with you, I may not agree with you, but I'll fight to the death your right to say it. That you can disagree, and that's fine. We're better off through enlightened conversation, even when there's disagreement. So that's the Enlightenment, and we'll talk a few more things about Enlightenment. Let's go impact and advantages of European disunity. So Europe was fragmented. There was a bunch of European countries, and that was actually a good thing that Europe was not united. Because Europe was fragmented politically in the 1500s, European countries were competing with one another. They were trying to one-up one another. So that forced those small countries. I mean, they're not big, France and England and Spain. They're not big. And because they're not one, they're constantly competing, trying to one-up, trying to get better, trying to improve their army, trying to get better scientists, trying to get better technology. The fact that Europe has to compete with one another actually pushes Europe forward. And this is why, one of the reasons why we see the scientific revolution happening in Europe in the way it does. Now, how does this mean for me? What does it mean for me if I'm a religious person and I live in the scientific revolution or I live in the Enlightenment? Do I have to give up the belief in God? And the answer is no. A very popular view about God was called deism. This is the belief that there is a God, but this is not a God who is interacting in the world. This is not a God who listens to prayers. This is not a God who answers prayers. He certainly doesn't send his son to the world, or he doesn't rise people from the dead. Deism, they gave an example that God is kind of like a clockmaker. He designed the clock, he designed the mechanisms, he did all that, but after he designed the clock, he's walked away. He does not care. There is a God, but there's just not a God who's there for you personally. Thomas Jefferson's a good example of a deist. He didn't believe Jesus rose from the dead. He didn't believe Jesus did miracles, but he also thought atheism was foolish. Jefferson would probably argue that it's irrational to believe that everything came from nothing. So he's not a Christian, Jefferson. He's not an atheist. He is a deist. We also see a new group of people called the bourgeoisie. These are middle class people. These were people not born rich but who became rich through hard work, typically through banking or business or trade. Bourgeoisie are wealthy people, but they're not born wealthy with like a title like a duke or a noble. They're born rich. They're not born rich. They work their way to their wealth. They're hardworking middle class people. They're pretty rich through their efforts. One of the new things we also see at this time is something called a joint stock company. We talked about how today's world, there's companies and corporations, you can buy stock in them. And the thing about joint stock companies is it allows you to spread out the risk because you have many investors who might give $1,000 a piece or $2,000 a piece, and we pool our money. And so if the company fails, you lost $2,000 instead of $200,000. Spreads the risks, but also spreads out the profits as well. This is an early example of what we see in capitalism, and we'll see that throughout the course. We also see that once they get to the New World, there's something great that they discover because Europe enters what's called the Little Ice Age, and it gets super cold and it hurts crops in Europe. But good news, the New World gives two foods that are easy to grow in Europe and super cheap. Those two foods that the New World produces is corn and potatoes. They're both super cheap, easy to produce, and can survive in very cold temperatures. So that helps poor Europeans survive. You know that the Habsburgs are the most powerful European family in all of Europe. The Habsburg family at one point held the Netherlands, southern Italy, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburg overwhelmingly religiously were Catholic, and you might remember the Habsburg that we talked about was Charles V, who was the Habsburg who put Luther on trial. As a Catholic, he thought Luther was a troublemaker. He was dividing the Christian world needlessly. He was a heretic, Charles V thought about Luther, and needed to be eliminated. Charles V, Habsburg. We also talked about an important building in France that the King of France lived in a palace called Versailles. And the thing about Versailles was that this was where the King of France lived, and it was this huge palace, and it was a place where the King of France would have parties and gambling and drinking and drunkenness. And the thing about Versailles is that in France, the king believed in what's called the divine right of kings. In other words, if you ask the King of France, why should you be king? He'd say, God put me on the throne. And he used his palace Versailles. If there was people who didn't like him, he'd call them over to Versailles. Let's hang out, let's party, let's drink. And he would treat you so well. And you'd have such a good time in Versailles, you forget the fact that you didn't like what the king was doing. If you ever saw Hunger Games or read the books, you know, in the movie, they pick these young couple. They're going to go and fight for the the Hunger Games, and they put them on this train, and there's all this food and cake and candy, and a lot of these fighters forget about the fact that the capital is taking advantage of them because of all the free stuff. And that's how Versailles was, that they were feeding them and partying with these people, and they forgot the fact they didn't like the king. And so the king was able to be this authority figure and live out his divine right of kings. Well, in the Enlightenment, there was a guy named John Locke who didn't agree with divine right of kings. In fact, he said, I don't like the answer, God did it, and if the King of France says, well, I'm in charge because God made me here, I have the divine right of kings, John Locke said, no, the only reason that you get to rule is because you have the permission of the people, you have the consent of the people. And also, John Locke argued that there are something called inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. And if you take away my inalienable rights, guess what I have the right to do? I have the right to rebel, which is why we'll see Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence referencing the idea of rights, natural rights that cannot be taken away. So you don't rule because God put you on the throne. You rule because you have the consent of the people. And if you don't do what the people want, ultimately you can be removed from power. We also talked about in the next chapter, Diversity of American Colonial Societies, that there were some new diseases that wiped out the Native Americans. Smallpox was the number one disease that wiped out Native Americans up to 90%. Um, this was part of what we called the Columbian Exchange, that disease and food and plants and animals and people moved back and forth between the old and new world. One of the diseases that also came from Africa was malaria, and malaria is brought into the new world, sadly. And there's a couple, three reasons we talked about why Americas, North and South America, was easy to conquer. We said guns, germs, steel, and horses. The Native Americans had bow and arrows. They didn't have guns. The Native Americans had no exposure to smallpox. 90% of them died, up to guns, germs, and steel. They have armor protecting them, and then they have horses. Native Americans had none of. Because of guns, germs, and steel, the Spanish get to conquer the Aztecs of Mexico, the Inca of Peru, but the Portuguese who are in Brazil are kind of bummed they don't have any of those gold and silver, but they do find they can grow sugar, which is a highly desirable product, and they make a lot of money. The Spanish get to conquer from Mexico to the southern tip. Obviously, they dominate. And they have a real hands-on approach to ruling. In fact, there's a vocabulary word called viceroys. These are like government appointed governors. The Spanish are directly controlling the colonies. Not a lot of freedom. We don't see any voting or anything like that. And as they're directly controlling Mexico and Peru and Colombia and everywhere else, they use the Catholic Church to spread Spanish culture. They use the Catholic Church to spread the Catholic religion. They use the Catholic Church for education. The Catholic Church teaches you how to read, how to write, how to pray, how to speak Spanish. The church and being Latino get infused together. Now, Native Americans were abused, sadly, early on, and not all Catholic leaders were okay with that. There's a really famous Catholic priest named De las Casas, and he wrote and argued that we should not enslave, we should not abuse Native Americans who were being treated as slaves. That's great. De las Casas helped slavery among Native Americans be outlawed, but because De las Casas fought for the freedom and the rights of Native Americans, the Catholic Church, or the Spanish turned to enslaved Africans for labor sources instead. Now, early on, there's a word called encomienda, and this was like a forced labor system on those Native Americans, where Native Americans had to provide labor, food, or other goods, to these white Spaniards. Now, sadly, as the Native Americans died, there was less available to serve in this encomienda, this forced labor system. And so later on, we switched to something called the mita. And the mita said, well, we're only going to take 1 out of every 7 of you into service. And you don't have to be a slave for life. You just serve for 6 months. So the encomienda was like everyone's a part of this forced labor. The mita says, we'll just take 1 out of every 7 from your village, and they'll work for 6 months, like in the mines or something like that, and then we'll send them back. So that's still terrible, but a thing that happens is if I'm working with Spanish people for 6 months, I speak a Native American language, but now I'm working with white people that speak Spanish. This is how people start learning Spanish, by working with the Spanish, even in these forced conditions. And why, as the Native Americans die off from disease, why are enslaved Africans picked as the replacement? Well, the reason Native Americans died off is because they don't have the resistance to disease. But guess what? Africans do. They've had the same diseases shared between Africa and Asia and Europe for thousands of years. We also saw that there's a lot of intermarriage. Mestizos, of course, are half white, half Native American. There are mulattoes. They're half white, half black. Creoles are white people. Your mom and dad are born in Europe. You're the first generation white born in America. And for all these racial categories, we call these castas. There's like a pyramid of power with white people on the top, brown mixed people in the middle, and enslaved Africans on the bottom. Sad, but that's how the situation was. Some enslaved people could save up and pay for their own freedom. The vocabulary word of you saving up for your own freedom is called manumission, and we saw a low percent, maybe 1 to 3% of enslaved Africans were able to buy their own freedom, but it did happen sometimes. We then turned our attention to the English, which were very different from the Spanish colonies. They started like 100 years after the Spanish. They were early on, big failures like Jamestown, they built it on a swamp. 80% of the people died. No easy wealth in Jamestown. No money, no gold, no silver, no major Native American groups to take over. But they do find something they can grow, which was tobacco, and that makes money. We also see early on in the South, they brought poor white people to work. These were called indentured servants, poor white people who couldn't afford their own ticket. It was like 80% men who came to the South, not a lot of single women. And after 4 to 7 years of service, they became free. Partly because of that, they wanted to turn to enslaved Africans because I can own an enslaved African for their entire life. I own their children, grandchildren, great grandchildren. They thought it was in the future a better investment than an indentured servant. We also see early examples of democracy with the House of Burgesses, where they get to vote and make laws. We also see this in New England as well. We also see 4 types of crops grown in the American South: rice, which leads to enslaved Africans being brought in, tobacco, we see sugar, we see what we got: rice, sugar, tobacco. There's one more I am forgetting right now because I don't have any notes. I'll go over the 4th one in class if I can't think of it. So let's go on. We also see Gullah. This is a type of English with African roots. We watched a video of that and saw that this is an example of cultural mixing. And I think I didn't put it, but I do believe we have some other things that I didn't talk about. So other things I didn't talk about: Puritans and Pilgrims. New England, they didn't come for farming or for economics, but they came for religious freedom. The Puritans wanted to just change the Anglican Church, make it better. The Pilgrims wanted to get rid of the Anglican Church altogether. We also saw, I didn't put it on here, but we also see, well, I'll put it on here right now. Number 39 was Pennsylvania. The Mid-Atlantic was the most ethnically diverse of the colonies. In fact, there was a group of people that religiously did come, and those were the Quakers, and they tended to be pacifists. They were against slavery later on, and they did see farming in the Mid-Atlantic states, but not slavery like we saw elsewhere. Same thing with the Pilgrims and Puritans. We see a lot of trade, not a lot of slavery, nothing like that. So 3 different parts: the South, slave-based. It originally was indentured servants, it became slaves. The North, the New England, is all about trade and business. They're rich, they're white, they're wealthy, they're Protestants, they're whole families that go to the New England. The Mid-Atlantic, super ethnically diverse. There's Dutch, there's Germans, there's English, there's French, and we do see farming still, but no slavery. So with that being said, I think we kind of went through it all. I'll take maybe some last minute questions before it starts on Monday. I think I made my less than 30-minute mark. Thank you so much for taking a listen. See you on Monday.